It's often exciting to look to the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a good look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that help make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. It's the summer of 1985. It's a beautiful day here in Omaha, and it's a rather special day because we're at the home of Dr. Roy Steele, who many of you know and remember well as a member of our faculty in economics for many, many years. He comes to us out of a background we're going to discuss in a program we've come to call Reflections in Time. And we thought it'd be a nice place to do it right at home. Roy and his wife's home are right near the university, and that's what we're going to talk about, his life, their life, and the life of the university during the many years he was with us until his retirement in 1985. Roy, I'm glad we could get together and you know, talk about some of these things. You and I have known each other for, a good part of 30 years, I guess, but I don't think I've ever asked you, you know, where do you come from, Roy? I've always known you, and your family is a part of the university. That wasn't always the case. You came from where?
Well, I was born in Kirkwood, Illinois, Paul, which is
not too terribly far away.
No, a little town of about 700 people on Highway 34, just about 25 miles across the river from Burlington, Iowa.
Oh, down south
Down
there.
south, you know, and the small grade school back in the 20s is, of course, is where I went.
Country school?
Country school, you know.
You bet, I know.
2 classes in the classroom with 1 teacher and this sort of thing. And my father worked on the CB&Q at that time. Now, of course,
back in the railroad days.
Back in the railroad days.
Yeah.
And I remember him coming home in 1932 and saying to Mom, do you want to move to Burlington? And she said, no. He said, well, if I'm to continue my job with the railroad, we'll have to move. Because at that time they were cutting back in positions and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
So we moved to Burlington, Iowa. And I entered 8th grade there in the junior high in Burlington, Iowa. That was one of the early days of junior highs.
Now you come to town.
Yeah. Come to the big city.
And yes, early days of junior high, those were quite new in those days, weren't they?
That's right.
Really sort of an experimental beginning.
Junior high. And
quite a change from country school, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was embarrassing to me. I remember bringing my lunch the first day in a milk pail and going up to the room I was assigned, and there was all of these students in there, about 30 or 40, and here I banged that milk pail right against the door, and I was really embarrassed. I was a country bumpkin. Yeah. And but I went to the 8th and 9th grade then, graduated from this Horace Mann Junior High School there in Burlington, Iowa.
Did you like school at that time? Did you enjoy it?
Yes, I did, really. And it was somewhat fun. But then at the end of the 9th grade, many people, many of the students, of course, didn't go on to high school.
Oh, sure. That was kind of unusual back in those days.
That was a termination point. In fact, my parents didn't want me to go to high school.
Do you remember why?
They felt, by and large, that 9th grade education was pretty good. You see, I have 3 older brothers and a sister. And they went to 8th grade there in Kirkwood, and that was the end of their education. They never went to high school. My father had an 8th grade education. My mother only went to the 3rd grade. And, of course, they didn't really see the point of going on, this sort of thing. And a friend of mine who lived in the neighborhood was going on, and so I wanted to go on as well. And the folks said, well, if you want to go on, you can live here at home, but you'll have to pay your own school expenses and buy your own clothes.
Sounds like in more recent days somebody going on to college. You were just trying to go to high school.
I was trying to get to high school. And so I did. I carried papers and did lots of odd jobs and so forth and so on, and made my way along. I didn't get to participate in some of the activities I might have liked to have done because I had to work in that respect. So I didn't get into athletics other than in track. In my junior and senior year, I got to do track, you know, and that is why I like to jog to this very day.
Yes, yes.
And so I graduated then in '37 from Burlington High School. At that time, there was the elderly principal of the high school. They all called in all the seniors and asked them what they were going to do individually. And when my turn came, he said, what are you going to do, Steele? I said, I'm going to try and find a job, hopefully on the railroad, taking after my father. He said, you're not going on to college? I said, no. He said, well, that's probably a pretty good idea. I was not the best student. I was an average student in high school. I didn't set the world on fire in that respect. So I did. I worked, never got on the railroad, of course, because they weren't hiring anybody.
Those weren't the best of times, were they, for jobs?
Those weren't the best of times for jobs.
No.
And I finally got a factory job and moved along on various jobs of that nature in the next 3 years at about $15 a week. Yeah, that was about the average wage on most jobs, $12 to $15 a week.
Were you able to live on that?
And I lived on that, lived at home with my parents. And then my father died of cancer in '39.
Oh, did he?
And then I supported my mother.
You know, I wanted to ask you, as you're going along, we'll pick it up right from there, but you lived, as many of us have, through the Depression years.
Right.
You've alluded to it briefly, I think, and you mentioned the low wage that you had in those years coming out of it. Do you remember the Depression and what it was like to your friends and your family, what it meant to you?
Oh, not probably in the same way that others did. Of course, you got all of these media expressions on radio and Roosevelt's comments and so forth and so on. This seemed to a Midwestern boy a little bit distant, though.
But your dad had work all through that
My dad
period.
had work all through there, so I wasn't touched in that sense.
The only problem you had was having to move to town, really.
Right, that's exactly.
So you were very fortunate then.
That's very true. And of course, when we got to Burlington, why the factories had closed there, you know, and people would be waiting for them to open. That's always seemed to be the case, waiting for the factory to open back up. And of course, for some time, they didn't open. No. And it became a kind of a waiting game, so to speak, for some of these people, and we noticed that. And,
a lot of credit at the grocery store,
right.
I bet.
And I noticed, too, that some students in class at that time, remember I told you I went to junior high in those days. Our homeroom teacher at that time checked to see how whether the students had enough to eat or not. She'd call them in individually and chat with them, and she chatted with me, and I remember most of us would take our lunch every day in wrapped in newspaper in those days.
Sure.
Because there wasn't enough paper bags to have brown, but usually wrapped in a newspaper,
Yeah.
and we could eat in the cafeteria. They had a cafeteria there that was quite nice, but usually we brought our lunch, of course, didn't buy anything in the cafeteria, because even though the dishes were a nickel apiece, or maybe for something special a dime, it was
Yeah.
relatively inexpensive, but still the nickels and dimes didn't be with a number of those students.
No.
And I never liked milk. I never drank milk, even though I was from
From
the farm area. I just didn't like milk. And my homeroom teacher, I was sitting there with my colleagues eating on my lunch and drinking water with my lunch. And the homeroom teacher came over and put a pint of milk beside me. They had a milk program which they gave away milk to students. And I was so embarrassed that she put that pint of milk, and a pint of milk in those days was 5 cents there at the cafeteria.
Mm-hmm.
And I just looked straight ahead and finished my lunch and left and let the milk sit. Let the milk sit right there. But some of the students, and we had 3 black students in junior high at that time, and they had a real difficult time, of course.
So it was all around you.
Didn't get really enough to eat.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that in that respect, it did come back, but not in the crucial sense that some people remember and some families remember. I always had something to eat.
Well, that's
in other
good.
words,
That's
a place
good.
to stay, and,
Yeah.
and something to put on my back.
Speaking of that, though, you said in 1939 your dad died.
Right.
And then it was up to you to win the
I
bread.
was supporting my mother. We paid $18 a month for the house.
You were
And
buying it, or were you renting it?
no,
for
no,
that?
renting.
Uh-huh.
And I was working in a grocery store at that time, and getting $15 a week, of course,
Mm-hmm.
at that time. And so with the rent, utilities didn't amount to anything, probably about $1 or $2 a month.
Is that right?
And my mother and I could eat very easily on $5 a week.
Uh-huh.
So it was enough.
You were able to support your mom and you.
But I supported her there for a year that way. And
You were learning the value of $1, weren't you?
Oh, yes. Yes. And she decided then to go live with her sister back in Kirkwood.
Oh.
So we broke up housekeeping, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Sold all of that old furniture, some of it I'd like to have back today,
Yes.
as antiques in those days. But I went then to live at the Y. The Y was $1 a day. Went down to the YMCA, and that's where I lived.
$7 a week.
Right. And
Well, that cost you more than renting the house.
yeah. Yeah. I had a girlfriend, relatively steady in those days, and she was the sister-in-law of the assistant superintendent of schools, you know, that just retired.
Here in Omaha?
Here in Omaha.
Oh, maybe the name will come to us. I can't think of it
And
right
I
now.
can't think of the name at the moment, but she talked me into saying, you ought to go on to college.
Oh, now you're getting college talk, huh?
Now we're getting back to college. And we took a train ride one day because she had, her sister going to northern Iowa then.
Oh, yeah.
Cedar Falls.
Yes.
And we took the old
Iowa
train up
Teachers,
there.
as it was called.
And I talked to this dean of men up there on a Saturday morning, and I told him I don't have a dime to my name, but I certainly would like to somewhere or other go to college. He said, forget it. You don't have any money. You just can't work your tuition and make your living and so forth and so on that way. So we went back, and I was rather disappointed. But we had a junior college there in Burlington, Iowa, and so I went over and talked to them to see what how they could come out.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, and this was in 1940, at that time Robert White was principal of the high school and also dean of the junior college at that time. He had both roles.
Mm-hmm.
Robert White became later on the president of Kent State when they had the Kent State affair there in the 70s. And Robert White said, if you want to put a cot down in the furnace room and be night watchman here and watch the building, that will be your tuition, and also give you a place to stay that won't cost you anything.
Hey, this sounds pretty good.
So I did that.
And off you
I
went to
enjoyed that first year as freshman there. I carried 21 hours, and
wow,
made
you started with a
virtually straight
load.
And one of my teachers was a fellow by the name of Bill Utley, whom everybody will remember.
Is that right? It's the summer of 1985. We're doing what's called Reflections in Time, and the time reflection we're doing today is with Dr. Roy Steele, a member of economics faculty, Kaiser professor, been with us for so long at the university, and we've been talking about his early life, where he came from in Illinois, and on into the point where he started to go to college, and I believe the last name he mentioned when we ended the first tape was a very familiar one.
That's right.
Bill Utley.
Bill Utley.
Member of our faculty for such a long time, and you were going to junior college in Burlington.
Iowa. That's right. And I finished my freshman year, and then that summer of '41, I had to go into the military along with everybody else.
Yeah, it's time for World War II now.
That's right. And so I went into the military and went overseas and got back safely in '45.
Where'd you spend your time in service?
Well, I did my basic training at Camp White up in Oregon.
Oh.
And later on at Corvallis. So I got some familiarity with the
Great Northwest
for a change. And I was with the 91st Infantry Division. We went overseas relatively late. We went over in the spring of '44 in North Africa, and the fighting in North Africa was over. And then we hit the beach just north of Naples at that time.
Oh, you got in on the Italian campaign.
Right, and I spent my time in the Italian campaign under General Clark's Fifth Army, and moved up the boot, so to speak, little by little, the so-called forgotten front, while the invasion, etc., of moving across Europe was gaining most of the media attention.
Yes.
Type of thing then today's. And so we were up just north of Bologna, in the little town of Treviso, Italy, up near the Alps, when the VE Day came. And so that was a good period.
Yeah, that was a great day. I was at Camp Lucky Strike out near the French coast.
Oh, were you?
Yeah.
They had odd names for those camps.
Wait, I guess I'd come back to America by that time, but that's that great period, wasn't it? Exciting.
Right. Everything, yeah. And I left my unit. I stayed over there. Of course, at that point, we had enough points to probably be discharged. In fact, the division came back here in the summer of 45 and was disbanded. It never went over.
For those who are
Japan.
watching this tape, when you say points, many of the young people won't know what you mean. Tell them about the points. They were great.
The points were great. They depended upon, of course, how long you were in service, how long you were overseas in service,
Right.
this type of thing, and as they built up.
And the battles you'd been in on
The battles
sometimes?
you'd been in on and that type of thing. And so you accumulated points that way, and pretty much the same way that a flyer in those days would accumulate missions.
Mm-hmm.
And after so many missions, they would get a rest and rehabilitation type thing, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the point development they had was for eventual order of discharge.
You bet.
Yeah, that was a big thing. So I had enough points to go back, but I stayed over there because back in the States, I went to Adjutant General School back in Washington, D.C., and that's where I met my wife.
Oh, did you?
Dorothy, an English girl, and she was over here in the British Army in cryptographic service down on Constitution Avenue.
Ah.
Well, I met her over here, and then, of course, we'd made arrangements to get married. So to process this, at the end of the war, I was assigned with General Clark's office and went up to Vienna, Austria for the fall of 45 and winter of 45 until we could get this marriage consummated, because Dorothy was back in London at that time, and so we were going to be married in London. So from Vienna, I got over about Christmas time, and we were married on the 29th of December of 1945. This is our year of a 40th anniversary.
Uh-huh.
And then I went back.
Congratulations, Roy.
Thank you. Went back to Vienna and was processed to be returned to the United States, and was discharged then eventually in February 46. And during this time, of course, you were in the middle of semesters and you couldn't go to school, but all this time in service, it was my one objective, and Dorothy agreed with it, that I go back to school and get my baccalaureate degree.
You really were onto this college approach
right.
now, aren't you?
That's right. I wanted to finish that education.
No encouragement from the family especially, but from your wife and from others around you, you were encouraged, weren't you?
I remember my mother saying that, when are you going to stop going to school and go to work? It just sort of puts indelible the fact that they just weren't familiar with that much education.
No.
So also during the service, I wanted to, I got the idea that I wanted to be in foreign service, join the foreign service.
Oh.
There was a better way of solving these problems among nations than fighting about it, I thought. And so I naively didn't know where else to go, and I just took off for Washington, D.C. I thought if I want to get into foreign service, Washington, D.C. is a place to go. And first of all, I was in Washington, D.C. then in April. Dorothy was coming over to meet me in May, and I went out to Georgetown University, and they were filled back in those days, they filled very quickly because of the GI Bill, a number of people.
Oh, yes.
And they just hadn't had those kinds of numbers in college prior to the war. And they'd fill the undergraduate quota which they had. If I'd been a graduate student, I could have gone there. But this was a disappointment because I'd planned this all out, what I was going to do.
Sure.
I got back on the streetcar there, going down Pennsylvania Avenue, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and there wasn't anybody on the streetcar, and I was talking to the motorman and what I'd done and so forth and so on. And he said, why don't I let you off here at 22nd in Pennsylvania, and you go walk over there a couple of blocks to George Washington University and see if you can get into George Washington University. He did, and I went over, and I got enrolled in George Washington University and started classes then in the summer of '46.
Is that right?
Just about the time that Dorothy got over and we got established there and so forth and so on. And then I finished my Foreign Affairs degree there in 1948.
So you really were zeroing in on foreign service?
That's right. I'd gotten interested in the international arena.
Sure.
Up until, in the process though, from what professors had said, and of course a number of the classes were taught by people that worked in the Foreign Service in the capital there. They'd come out and teach a class and so forth. I'd gotten the impression that I probably didn't really want to do this. Then, of course, came the decision as to what to do when I was going to graduate.
Sure.
I went over and talked to the dean of the college, who was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and we had kind of a friendship. I said, I think I'd like to teach. And to show you how naive I still was in this, he'd said, well, if you want to teach, what you ought to do is go back to Iowa and get your graduate work at Iowa, if you want to teach. And so, you know, without further inquiry or knowing that I was really thinking about teaching at the university level, and I could do that anywhere in terms of graduate work, we packed up and went back to Iowa City. I'd tried to ask myself, well, what do I want to do graduate major in? Foreign Affairs seemed like political science was the closest, and so I was accepted in political science. In fact, on the basis of my record, they even gave me a scholarship, which I
You're a good
even,
student, evidently.
I was getting to be a much better student than I was in high school.
Back in junior high school, huh?
Yeah. And so I did my classwork, my 30 hours of my master's degree, and wrote my thesis in 2 semesters.
2 semesters?
2 semesters. The fall and the spring semester. I had my master's degree in June of '49.
Now that's almost a record, I would think.
It was too much of a record, really, for them. I virtually had to do it, though, Paul, because my thesis advisor, who was really at that time the only international man, old Professor Van der Zee, was retiring, and he was going to be through in
and you wanted
June.
to finish before
And
he
you
was.
know, I had to finish right along with him, and that was what mainly was a hurry about. And so, you know, we were living from hand to mouth in those days in Iowa City, and along with a lot of other students.
A lot of GIs
And
back in graduate
you know,
school, weren't there?
Say, well, can you get a job teaching in college with a master's degree? Well, it was pretty difficult because in those days, even the people who had a PhD in political science were finding teaching job's tough.
What year was this, Roy?
And this is 49.
Yeah.
Now, see. And I had a friend who was finishing up his Ph.D. in political science by the name of David Scott.
Is that right?
That's right. David
One of
Scott.
our colleagues here for so many years.
That's right. And so some of the, you know, I'd send out applications, but nothing whatsoever. And so the fellow said, "Why don't you go over to economics?" This was a big laugh. Start PhD in economics to me, because the only economics I'd had was in my foreign affairs program, 12 hours. But I went over to old Dean Phillips there and said, "Is it possible to work on a PhD in economics?" I told him what my background was. He said, "Yes, you'll have a lot of reading to do, but perfectly possible." So in the summer of '49, I was enrolled in economics, and there at the University of Iowa.
And started to do a lot of reading.
That's right. And another colleague I met over there was already engaged in his doctoral work in economics and finance, and that was, of course, George Harris.
Yes, another
So
of
I
our
met
colleagues who
George
we've reported
Harris.
on this
Right.
series. Yeah.
And so I went until 1950, and as I said, things were getting a little bit tight, and I kept trying each year to apply for a teaching job for a period of time. And so not much coming along in that way.
Still pretty
After all, I had a master's in political science, but I didn't have, even though I had a year of work in graduate economics, I didn't have an economics degree.
You were sort of in
So I was in between
between.
things,
Yeah,
I think.
yeah.
But when we were pretty well positioned to wear it through another year. In July of 1950, I got a letter from Kansas Wesleyan University down in Salina, Kansas, and said we would be interested in you for a one-year appointment in terms of teaching the economics and maybe some government courses. It seemed like it fit right in. The president of that institution, who had just taken over, was A. Stanley Trickett.
You keep running into people that became our colleagues.
Developing all of these
Yes. Last thing we talked about as we finished tape number 2 in your series was coming under Stanley Trickett
right
to not University of Nebraska at Omaha, but Kansas Wesleyan.
Kansas Wesleyan.
Your
down
first
there in
teaching
Salina,
job.
Kansas. My first teaching job.
How was it?
And I enjoyed it. As I had said previously, I was to fill in for a professor that was on leave of absence for 1 year.
So this is for
this
a
was
1 year?
1 year. I thought it would be a good opportunity to find out if I really wanted to teach university.
Oh, sure. That sounds reasonable.
Well, Trickett kept me there for 4 years.
Oh, is that right?
And we left together, in fact. But I found out that I enjoyed teaching and I enjoyed the students. Also found out another thing, Paul.
Huh?
I found out that this type of relationship was what I wanted to continue. So even when I'd completed my doctorate, I never wanted to go to a large university or state university or this sort of thing. I wanted to stay on a relatively small type of campus that was basically interested in teaching.
And you found the big campus when you were at Iowa University, of course.
I hadn't been on a small campus, really.
No.
And
well, now you were
so
no
I found
spring
out
chicken when you started to teach. You'd been around, you'd been in service, you'd been working at other things, you'd helped support the family. How old were you when you got into this first job, you and your good wife down there with Trickett?
I was the ripe age of 31.
And as you say, you stayed there 4 years, found that this is what you like to do, this is the size school you like to be in, or the smaller
Right.
university, whatever. And what happened then?
I finally was invited by the head of the economics department at Iowa back to be an instructor.
Oh.
I got an instructorship there. And so we decided that I might as well go on. If I liked this type of work, which I did, I might as well go on and get my PhD.
Oh, yeah, you hadn't finished your PhD
No, I hadn't
yet.
finished the PhD.
No.
Remember, I only had a year there
That's
in
right.
economics.
Yeah, yeah.
Never having had any economics before.
You learned a lot on the
Yeah.
job, probably.
I learned a lot. This is the way you do learn, is by
Sure.
teaching, because you have to do it, and the students keep your feet to the fire,
Yeah.
and you learn. You learn more than the students did.
Indeed so.
I know that I did in that respect. So then in '54, I went back to the University of Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
and I was there 3 years finishing up my PhD, which I got in 1957.
And teaching while you were there, too,
And
right?
teaching economics there.
Which
to
made for a busy time.
engineering students and pharmacy students
Ah.
and so forth and so on. Busy,
Uh-huh.
busy time. But I wound up in the June 1957 graduation class. And at that time, although we didn't know each other, the one at the toward the earlier part of the PhDs in that ceremony was a fellow by the name of Blackwell.
Well, here comes another one. Vic Blackwell.
Vic Blackwell. So, I never came to the University of Omaha off the bat, but I remembered the type of school I was looking for.
Yes.
And I wanted to stay in the Midwest. I didn't want to go to the populous East or South or far West. And so I found a position in economics and business at Washburn University down in Topeka,
Oh,
Kansas.
now we're getting closer to here, but
And it
Washburn.
was a still pretty much of a municipal university at
Sure.
that time.
Yeah, yeah.
It had not gotten state assistance.
No.
So I went down there, and I taught mostly finance courses.
Oh. Sounded like you were more in the business school than in the economics school.
Well, the economics and business was together, but I never got the opportunity to teach economics, or as much economics as I wanted to teach, which caused me, while I was there 4 years, caused me to be looking around for a position in which I could teach and concentrate pretty much on the matter of economics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because Washburn, again, was one of those types of schools in which you could get very much involved with the students, and it was the type of place I liked. There was no dissatisfaction on that basis. But in the meantime, of course, I'd seen George Harris relatively frequently at the economics meetings and so forth and so on.
And we're becoming
in the
acquainted with the
looking
university
process,
probably
yeah.
by that, huh?
So first part of May, we were sitting down to the evening meal. I was going back and teach a class in statistics at night there. And I got this telephone call from a man by the name of Roderick Crane.
Uh-huh.
And Roderick asked me if I would be interested. He'd talked to Harris and Trickett, Utley, all of these people, you see, that I'd been in the past, so to speak, were there, and interested in coming up. And
They were all here
looking
then.
to things. They
And
were all
knew
here.
you.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
And so I came up and looked the place over.
What was your first impression of the university when you first came to it?
You know, Paul, one of the things that President Bale used to say, one of the brightest night spots in Omaha.
Yes.
And
The busiest night spot in Omaha.
right. and Epley, which was a library at that time, Epley Library, and the first part of the Student Center
just brand new.
Just built, brand new, and this looked like a real bright campus, because my first trip around the campus was in the evening. I was there. I stayed with Trickett at his home in this visit, and George Harris and Trickett guided me around the campus and through this area. And it looked so bright and clean, and nothing which back at that time I'd encountered really, because most of the buildings were old and difficult to maintain and that type of thing.
So you were impressed with the physical plan, huh?
I was impressed with that physical plan. And of course, I was impressed. Here I'm meeting these people again on their own home ground, and they seem to be quite happy about it, and so forth and so on. And so we got together, and I came up to be the only economist with Rod Crane. Rod and I were the only one. At that time, Rod had been pretty much on his own. There had been a few part-time people teaching classes, but Rod had been really the regular.
And he was also an assistant to the president, wasn't he?
That's right. He had this
advising him
role
in
of
various
assistant to
matters.
the president. His office was next to Milo Bales there in the old administration building. And I officed in a little pigeonhole there, right along with Glenn Lewis.
Oh,
Glenn I was among the business people, even though the economics department at that time had always been with the College of Arts and Sciences.
And was quite separate for business school.
Yeah. But, you know, they didn't have the old administration building, of course, was where the classes were anyway. They didn't have any of them.
That's where everybody was,
That's where
pretty
everybody
much.
was. And so it wasn't difficult to know people and see everybody every day, marching up down those halls. You're all in the same building. Wonderful experience as far as I was concerned.
Didn't you feel in those first years while you were coming to a school that was smaller than the University of Iowa, but certainly bigger than some of the places you had taught and lived, that it was really kind of a nice, close-knit place because of the physical setup here?
Yeah, that's right. And yet it seemed to have a certain largeness about it. And of course it was municipal at that time.
Now, as you came here to teach in the 1950s, you and your family came here, what was the program like that you were teaching in? You mentioned that you and Rod Crane were doing the teaching in economics. Was it a relatively small operation then because of the numbers and the courses you offered? What was it like?
Well, it was a small operation with two people trying to carry on a major there.
Easy to have faculty meetings.
Right. There wasn't any problem with respect to faculty meetings. And but as you remember, Paul, the teaching schedule was 15 hours.
That was normal load.
That was a normal load. And that meant, of course, 5 courses.
Yeah.
And 2 or 3 of those were over in the old Engineering 101 that held 333 students.
I know the place well.
You know the place well. And Rod taught the principal students in the daytime, and I had the corresponding night. Rod didn't, at that point, of course, we get a place where he didn't want to teach at night.
No.
So I had that room full in the nighttime.
For those 3-hour classes?
That's right, plus the few other courses that we had, we carried on with respect to a major.
Made for some long days,
That's
didn't it, Roy?
Long days. And this was probably, as far as teaching was concerned, the first thing that overwhelmed me. I'd taught at night down at Washburn, as I mentioned, but a course was offered twice a week at night.
Mm-hmm.
Here, you taught the course one night. You were there for 3 hours.
That was a big load of hay, wasn't it?
And that was a little overwhelming at first for me, this sort of thing. And not only that, but I was feeling very sorry for students who had to sit in those seats for that long, because I know how restless I certainly would be, even in terms of having a break somewhere during the middle. But then we, before Rod retired, in those days, of course, you had to retire at 65, and Rod retired in 1965, but in those 3 or 4 years, we added another staff member from Nebraska, Larry Denton.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were 3 of us. And Rod retired in 65, and Bale said, "Do you want a full professorship, or do you want to be chairman of the department? I'm not going to give you both." So I said, "Well, I'll take chairmanship." So in 65, I became chairman of the economics department, and the following year, I became professor of economics.
So one followed the other by not too much time.
By not too much time. And
now you were not only an administrator, but you were a teacher.
That's right.
20 years ago, about, from the time we're recording this now.
And in 1966, as you know, Milo Bale reached the age of 65, and it became a matter of the possibility of successors for Milo Bale.
Yes.
And so one of the things I recall in that they set up a committee. This was the first time that I had encountered that. They set up a faculty committee to concern themselves with possible successors as president.
Mm-hmm.
And while it represented the various colleges and the university at that time, it was pretty much dominated by the people in the arts and sciences.
Mm-hmm.
One thing the arts and sciences people knew they did not want was a person coming from the College of Education, an educational background of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted a president with more of an arts and sciences background. I wasn't myself on the committee. Phil Bolt was chairman of the committee, and I think that George Harris was on the committee from the business college, and various people, but we took a man that had been president down at Southwest Missouri State, where Dave Scott had been his executive assistant down there in Missouri, Lee Trawick.
This is about the time when we need to wind up, and we'll begin with the Trawick presidency and things relating to it when we come back. Is that all right, Roy? We've been into now our third tape visiting with Dr. Roy Steele, who is a member of our faculty here and now in retirement in 1985, on Reflections in Time. We'll be back in just a moment with another segment. I guess it's segment number 4, as Roy reflects on his time at UNO. We're doing the series known as Reflections in Time, and this is the 4th tape in a series that we've been recording this morning in the home of Roy Steele, the summer of 1985, and we're working here in his home on South 67th Avenue, I believe is the address.
Right.
Right, near the university, where he spent a lot of years. And the point at which we ended up on tape number 3 there, Roy, was where the time in the 60s when Dr. Bale was about to retire, and they were working on replacing him, and they did.
Right.
With Dr. Leland Trawick, who came from down in the general area where you came from, really.
Well,
that
not really
part of the
from
country.
where I came from.
No,
further south. That was.
I guess I was regionalizing.
The southwest part of Missouri is south.
Yeah. But he had been at the school with Scott, your colleague, and that sort of thing. And,
that's right.
All right.
Scott had been his executive assistant down there. But Scott had already come up here to head up the Department of Political Science.
Mm-hmm.
So Scott was already here. And Trawick, as I had indicated earlier, was the type of product that by and large the College of Arts and Sciences wanted. Was somebody from a discipline in the arts and sciences.
Mm-hmm.
Trawick had his PhD in economics. I never knew Trawick. I'd known of him. He taught up at Michigan State. And by that time, I was very much into this matter of economic education with program with the teachers, and it was being involved nationally to a great extent. I started with it when I was down at Washburn, and they held national seminars for this, and I was invited to one in 1963 or 64 in there back to New York City. Well, Leland Trawick was one of the lecturing participants in that seminar. So this was the first time that I'd met him, and of course the last time I'd met him until he came here as president then. And so he had virtually the calendar year. He came in when Bale retired in January of 1967 and stayed that 12-month period.
Very short period of time.
That's right, very short period of time. This was a interesting period because it was developing as to whether the city should continue to support or whether it should move to a state branch of Lincoln or whatever it might be called, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And one of the problems I think that was involved, as I understand it in that period, was Trawick wanted to see this remain a municipal university. Now, municipal universities were disappearing.
Yes.
But there was something unique in the fact that the city had the university. And Trawick got on the side of keeping the university as a municipal university. Well, by and large, the power structure saw this as an opportunity, if they could get the state to accept it, I think, to get the university off the local tax back, which, of course, you never do, because now they're paying 2 or 3 times the taxes that they paid there.
Yes.
Now that this university is part of the state.
Yeah.
Well, Trawick was forced out in December, as I say, the end of the semester there, fall semester in '67, and replaced by Naylor, who, of course, had been President Bale's assistant for so many years, and this particularly didn't set with many of the people in arts and sciences, because there again they had someone who was from the College of Education sort of thing back in. And they worked for the university to become state, and the legislature accepted it, and the city voted for it because they thought they were going to get rid of taxes. You don't get rid of taxes. You just move them to another level first. And there was a lot of pros and cons at that time as to what was going to happen to the university, because as it sat when in July the university became part of the university system. There really wasn't a system. There was the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and the Med Center, and they had not really viewed themselves as a system. And then along comes this campus of UNO now at Omaha, and the only president that was in charge, of course, was the president there at Lincoln, Cliff Hardin, just before he left. And so he was more or less in charge of the 3 campuses at that time. And then, of course, this started about where the position and who was going to get what or lose what in the transfer.
Yeah.
The city lost a great deal because at that time, I remember that they valued the university's property at $35 million. And the city literally gave the state $35 million for nothing. And I was tremendously impressed with Milo Bale in terms of the dollars that he had available to him, that he made those dollars go a long way. He was able to get $2 worth of goods for every dollar he spent. And when you begin to involve administrations that are really not that close to the taxpayer or the political aspect of life, there isn't that examination of, do we really want to do this? Can we really afford it? Is it really worthwhile to examine a budget in terms of paying its own, rather than just automatically, well, we need more money this time, we'd like to do this, and so we put it on the agenda and put a few more, and we just keep moving along in terms of that particular pace. You know, Paul, we don't have a great deal larger enrollment in relation to the land acquisitions that we've acquired now here on this campus. And remember, what we were saying, we put all of these classes initially in the old administration
building.
And then they built part of the engineering building, and then, of course, we were in there. And this was pretty much the classroom space.
Sure.
Until these others, but then we moved along with regard to the system, and we built more buildings, and it's been expanding.
A couple of minutes left. People that stand out. You mentioned Dr. Bale. Other people that you remember that really stand out in memory?
Well, of course, obviously Rod Crane. I've always admired Rod Crane. Of course, he's been dead for several years, but he guided me around Omaha.
Yes, he knew Omaha.
With respect to, he knew Omaha, and he knew the people that by and large were the so-called power structure, the people, the generations, or the 2 generations, that basically were people who had inherited their money, not had made a bundle of money real quick, not the new people, but the old people, who were by and large from families who had inherited their money in this area.
Other quickly names that you think of that really stand out?
And of course, I've always liked Bill Utley and Stan Trickett. You know, they were always great figures. And Paul Beck. Paul was a good friend there in history, and we brought one of my old students to the history department that I'd had down in Kansas Wesleyan. Ert Gum came up to teach in history, and it had just, when you start to pick out, Paul, a number of people, That's just skimming the top.
Yes.
Because this was a place in which there were people. I haven't even mentioned the staff like Thelma and Thelma Engel,
Harold
Kiefofer, and Jane Kemp. And
sounds like you enjoyed yourself here.
It's been very good.
Well, the university's been good to us, and we're thankful for your contribution to it. And I've enjoyed visiting with you, Roy, and I thank you for your time and sharing with us for future generations your life and times here at UNO and the University of Omaha and what we call Reflections in Time.